One day in 1974, a Serbian performance artist named Marina Abramović conducted a shocking experiment on human nature. She set up an open room with 72 objects, including lipstick, roses, scissors, daggers, and even a handgun. She then informed the onlookers that for the next 6 hours, she would be in a state of anesthesia, allowing them to use any of the objects on her body however they wished. Marina promised that no matter what actions they took, she would not hold them accountable afterward. At first, the spectators behaved gently. Some placed roses in her hands, others wrapped a scarf around her, and some playfully scribbled on her body with lipstick. However, as time passed, the situation spiraled out of control. Someone cut her clothes to shreds with scissors. Another slashed her arm with a dagger. Some even went as far as to shove the barrel of the handgun into her mouth. By the time the 6-hour experiment ended, Marina's body was covered in wounds. This experiment left her deeply shocked and reflective. She had initially intended to reveal human kindness and empathy, but the result was the complete opposite. In an environment without moral constraints, human nature often reveals its darkest side. Summarizing the experiment, Marina once said, "This experience made me realize that if you give the public absolute power, you are not far from death." In today's recap, I will present you a famous film that similarly explores the darkness of human nature, Dogville. The movie may resemble a stage play with its minimalist set and theatrical style, but don't let its simple appearance fool you. This heavyweight suspense film was part of the Cannes Film Festival competition. The story takes place in Dogville, a remote town at the foot of the Rocky Mountains in the United States. The town is isolated and underdeveloped, with poor transportation. It consists of only 8 households and a total population of 22 people, 15 adults and 7 children. Besides them, a lonely old dog roams the town daily. Despite the hardships of life, the residents live in apparent harmony. However, the sudden arrival of a mysterious woman gradually transforms this seemingly peaceful town into a horrifying trial of human morality. One evening, a sudden gunshot shattered the town's tranquility. Following the sound, a young intellectual named Tom encountered a woman named Grace at the town's entrance. She claimed to be on the run from a powerful gangster and had fled from the city to this remote place. Tom, instantly smitten by the beautiful and delicate Grace, first hid her in an abandoned mine and then concocted a lie to deceive the pursuing gangsters. Before leaving, the gang leader handed Tom a business card saying that if he ever found Grace, he could call and receive a generous reward. Despite growing up in a poor and desolate place, living off his father's pension and doing little else, Tom prided himself on his moral values. He often preached about virtue and encouraged people to do good. Thus, he did not hand Grace over for money. After the mob boss left, Tom temporarily took Grace into his home and persuaded her to stay in the town. Grace, intrigued by the seemingly simple and honest nature of the town, and having nowhere else to go, gladly accepted Tom's suggestion. However, allowing a stranger to settle in town was not a decision Tom could make alone. So, early the next morning, he gathered all the townspeople at the local church for a community meeting. The main topic was whether to accept Grace. When the residents heard that Grace was being hunted by a gang, they hesitated. But after Tom's persistent persuasion, they finally agreed to give Grace a 2-week trial period to see if she was suitable to stay. Tom informed Grace of their decision and advised her to help out the residents as much as possible over the next 2 weeks to earn their trust, and Grace followed Tom's advice. In the days that followed, she eagerly integrated into town life. She chatted with a blind old man who rarely left his home, helped an elderly woman weed and fertilize her trees, and looked after the children of busy housewives. Gradually, more and more townspeople grew fond of Grace, admiring her beauty and kindness. 2 weeks passed in the blink of an eye, and soon it was time for the residents to vote. According to their agreement, even a single objection from an adult resident would mean Grace had to leave. Grace had little confidence in this voting process, so she packed her belongings in advance, ready to leave at any moment. However, she was surprised to find that her bag had been filled with small gifts from the townspeople. Tom had drawn her a simple map of the way out of town. The children had given her pencils. An elderly woman had prepared some dry rations for her. Some even pooled together money for her travel expenses. Clearly, some residents were worried that Grace might not be allowed to stay, so they prepared these gifts for her. Grace was deeply moved by their kindness, and what touched her even more was the final vote. All 15 adult residents unanimously agreed that she could stay. Not only that, but the townspeople even built her a small house, giving her a place to truly call her own. Thus, Grace became a temporary resident of Dogville. She earned her living by doing odd jobs for others and was content with this simple and peaceful rural life. In the following days, she built deep friendships with the townspeople and even started a romantic relationship with Tom, who admired her. Grace began to believe she had escaped the darkness of her past and found a utopia where she could live happily forever. However, before she could truly settle into her happiness, things slowly began to spiral out of control. One day, a police officer suddenly drove into town and posted a missing person notice for Grace on the town's bulletin board. At first, the residents didn't think much of it, but just a few days later, the police returned, this time replacing the missing person notice with a wanted poster. Grace was accused of robbing a bank 2 weeks earlier, and there was a reward for turning her in. Although the residents knew for certain that Grace had been in town 2 weeks ago and couldn't possibly have committed the robbery, the wanted poster changed their perception of her. Many of the residents believed that continuing to shelter Grace would bring them risks. Therefore, they demanded that Grace take on more chores around the town while accepting a reduced wage. Grace, wanting to stay in the peaceful and harmonious town, gladly accepted their new demands, unaware that her nightmare was just beginning. At first, the residents were somewhat restrained, giving Grace only a little more daily work. But over time, they gradually grew accustomed to Grace's hard work and began pushing all the most difficult and exhausting tasks onto her. Grace worked tirelessly every day, like a spinning top, but the residents still seemed unsatisfied, becoming increasingly harsh. Perhaps they thought that taking Grace in was their greatest act of kindness, so whatever they asked of her was reasonable and non-negotiable. One day, while Grace was helping at a male farmer's house, the police suddenly arrived again to ask about her whereabouts. In panic, Grace had no choice but to hide in the farmer's house and stay indoors. Little did she know, the farmer had already developed an interest in her. Taking advantage of the fact that no one was home, he had reported her to the police and blackmailed her, forcibly assaulting her. That night, physically and emotionally exhausted, Grace told her boyfriend Tom about the incident. Tom immediately wanted to confront the farmer, but Grace stopped him, fearing it would anger the farmer and cause him to be expelled from the town. However, Grace's silence only led to endless harassment from the farmer. From then on, whenever she worked at the farmer's house, she was assaulted. Their affair was soon discovered by the farmer's wife and spread throughout the town. The farmer's wife blamed all the wrongdoings on Grace. One night, the woman and 2 sisters came to her house, angry and demanding an explanation. Without asking questions, they brutally humiliated Grace and then smashed several of her cherished ceramic dolls. These dolls, which Grace had saved up for and bought from the only grocery store in the town, were very precious to her. In her eyes, the dolls were not only beautiful collectibles, but also symbols of her friendship with the townspeople. Now that the dolls were broken, it seemed like this friendship had come to an end. Thinking this over, Grace finally decided to leave the town. But as a weak woman, she could not walk out of the surrounding mountains without transportation. In desperation, Grace asked Tom for help. Tom quickly found the only truck driver in the town and gave him $10 stolen for the fare, hoping he could take Grace away. The truck driver accepted the money and agreed to help. A few days later, Grace secretly hid in the truck driver's vehicle, leaving the town with him. However, halfway through the journey, the truck suddenly stopped. The driver climbed into the back of the truck and said that several police officers were checking passing vehicles ahead. Due to the risks involved, he demanded more money from Grace. But at that moment, Grace had no money and was unable to pay the increased fare. The driver took the opportunity to demand repayment in another form. Grace, wanting to escape the town as soon as possible, coldly accepted the driver's advances. After the driver was satisfied and restarted the vehicle, Grace fell asleep exhausted in the back of the truck. When she woke up again, she found herself back in the town. It turned out the truck driver had long coveted Grace's beauty, and his real purpose for this trip was to get close to her. Meanwhile, Tom's father discovered that $10 were missing from the house. To avoid punishment, Tom lied, claiming that Grace had encouraged him to steal the money. As a result, Grace, now back in the town, became a pariah, labeled a prostitute and a thief. To punish her and prevent her from escaping, the residents made her a strong dog leash. One end of the leash was attached to Grace's neck and the other end was tied to a heavy iron wheel. Grace had to exert all her strength to drag the wheel and move slowly. In the days that followed, Grace's life descended into a terrifying nightmare. During the day, the women assigned her endless physical labor, and at night the men would enter her hut one by one, using her as a tool for their desires. Even blind old men and innocent boys began to molest her without restraint. Tom was the only adult man who had not touched Grace's body. To awaken the townspeople's conscience and have them release Grace, Tom called another meeting. However, this did not help. Instead, the residents pressured him to choose between Grace and the town. Torn between the two, Tom decided, after much hesitation, to flee with Grace. However, before they left, Tom made an unusual demand. He asked Grace to spend one night with him. Grace flatly refused. In her view, all the men in the town could abuse her, but not Tom. She truly loved him, and she could not tolerate that love being tainted by a sordid transaction. Tom's fury at her rejection led him to tear off his facade, revealing his hypocritical nature. All this time, the only reason he hadn't forced himself on Grace like the others was not because he didn't want to, but because he placed himself on a moral high ground and simply had no face to go through with it. After humiliating Grace, Tom changed his mind. He decided to remain in the town as a self-proclaimed guardian of morality, while Grace had to disappear as soon as possible. To make this happen, Tom went home and found the business card left by the mafia boss, then dialed the number. A few days later, the mafia boss arrived in town with more than a dozen armed gang members driving 8 vehicles. Just as the townspeople were preparing to step forward and claim credit, they were taken hostage by the gang members. The gang members then unchained the dog leash around Grace's neck and respectfully escorted him into a car. Inside the car sat the mafia boss, not an assassin sent to kill Grace, but Grace's biological father. It turned out that Grace was inherently kind, compassionate, and selflessly loving, with a saintly disposition. Because she refused to take over her father's criminal empire, she had a fierce argument with him and then fled to this small town. At the beginning of the story, the gunshot Tom heard was actually the mafia boss threatening his daughter to take over the business. The police issued missing person notices and wanted posters were simply tools the mafia boss used to search for his daughter. Grace had lied to the townspeople, claiming she was being hunted by the mafia. She had only wanted to gain sympathy and stay in this peaceful town, experiencing the utopian life she had always dreamed of. But instead, she endured a hellish existence there. Still, Grace tried to convince herself to forgive those who had abused her, despite her father viewing her kindness as almost foolish. Inside the Cadillac, during their argument, Grace finally understands that her overwhelming moral standard of forgiveness isn't true compassion, but rather arrogance. Her father explains that only God has the authority to forgive sins and humans must establish boundaries. By forgiving without limits, she unknowingly allows evil to flourish. True fairness, he argues, lies in holding people accountable for their actions, and Grace's attempt to act like a divine figure only causes harm. Her father's words left Grace deep in thought. In the end, she decided to take over the family's criminal empire and ordered her father to have everyone in the town slaughtered. With a single command from the mafia boss, chaotic gunfire erupted outside the car windows. When the gunfire ceased, the entire town was left lifeless, except for Tom. Grace then stepped out of the car and personally killed the man she had once admired. Then she left with her father's convoy. By the time it was all over, the only living thing left in Dogville was a single dog. The town had truly become a Dogville. Dogville is a film that is extreme in both form and ideology. Despite its minimalistic setting and stage play-like cinematography, it delivers an enormous psychological impact on its audience. We may not necessarily agree with the film's perspectives, but we cannot deny that when evil begins to take root and spread, there must be a force to stop its momentum. Otherwise, the consequences will be unpredictable. And this force sometimes comes from the law, sometimes from morality, and sometimes from ordinary people like you and me who stand up against injustice. That's all for today's recap. See you in the next one.